The millennial reign of Christ, probably one of the most debated subjects in the book of Revelation, is found in Revelation chapter 20. Is it literal? Is it figurative? Will Christ really reign 1,000 years on earth? Those are some of the questions that people ask, and those are some of the things that we want to take a look at this week on Fridays with Phil. I'm Dr. Phil Mayo, and I would just like to share with you a few minutes of biblical insights to help you along the way. If you enjoy the content, please be sure to subscribe. The millennial reign of Christ is found in the first a few verses of Revelation chapter 20. In fact, Revelation 20 is divided into three main sections. The first section is the binding of Satan for 1,000 years, called the millennial reign, and the first resurrection, which is the resurrection of what appear to be martyrs, but could also be the resurrection of all the saints. In the second section, Satan is released after the 1,000 years reign of Christ, and he gathers all the nations to a place called the beloved city, probably Jerusalem, and surrounds the camp of the saints to destroy them, and fire comes from heaven and eliminates his army. He is then thrown into the lake of fire. And in the third section of Revelation 20 is the great white throne judgment and the resurrection of all the dead. This week we want to focus on the first part of chapter 20 in the millennial reign, and we may have to talk a little bit more about it next week because there are lots of things to say. I think the first thing we should do is talk about the role of this passage in chapter 20 and in the book of Revelation, and then we can branch off from there into what might be other views. The first thing you want to do with any book of the Bible is to understand how a passage fits within the book where it is located. What role does this section about the millennium play in the book of Revelation? Well, we have come off of chapter 19 in the last two videos where we have seen, actually even in chapter 18, the destruction of Babylon, and then in chapter 19, the rider on the white horse who comes and battles the nations and defeats them with the sword from his mouth. This presentation of a battle at the end of chapter 19 is actually the third time that a battle has taken place in the last three chapters. In fact, it's probably all the same battle. We have Armageddon, which is bold number 6 in chapter 16. In chapter 17, in verse 14, it describes in brief the arrival of the rider on the white horse and the defeat of the nations. And then in chapter 19, we get it in more detail. At the end of chapter 19, the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. And so in chapter 20, we are left with the question, well, the beast and false prophet, who are part of the unholy trinity, have been dealt with. What about Satan himself? And so the role of this passage, of course, in the book of Revelation is to talk about what happens to Satan. In fact, the first two-thirds of chapter 20 talks about the fate of Satan. So that's part of the role, is it's trying to show us, one, how God's people are being vindicated. You might recall back when we talked about the seals, that in chapter 5, and I've mentioned this, chapter 6 rather, I've mentioned this multiple times, that the seal 5, you have the saints under the altar who ask God, the one seated on the throne, how long, O Lord, holy and true, before you avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth? And I said at that time that this question is an overarching question to be answered or responded to in all of the book of Revelation. So this is the end of the response. This is what's going to happen. They're going to rise from the dead and reign with Christ. And their enemies, the beast, who has made war on the saints and overcome them for a short period of time, is going to be thrown into the lake of fire along with Satan himself and the false prophet. So this is the role of the passage that it plays in the book of Revelation. Sometimes we ask more of a passage in the Bible than it's intended to communicate. And I say that because we have a number of different views about what the millennium is and what this passage describes, and we just actually don't have enough information to really know. But again, as I said, there are some things that we can say. So let's take a look at Revelation chapter 20, verse 1. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand, and he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who was the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. So these verses basically provide a synopsis of what some of the details that are coming in the next few verses of the chapter. This is a way, if you remove the chapter division, you have the beast and the false prophet who are captured and thrown into the lake of fire. You have the destruction of the enemies of God, and the birds of the air gorge on their flesh. And then you have Satan, who is grabbed, chained, and thrown into the abyss. So Satan is bound, and the first resurrection takes place. Now, the first resurrection that takes place is the resurrection of those who have been beheaded by the beast. And of course, this becomes one of the debates that we'll have to talk about at another time, as to whether it's just the resurrection of the martyrs or is it a resurrection of all the saints. We should say something, however, about the 1,000 years. I think this is important. To get a little perspective, there actually is no millennial reign of Christ found in Judaism. This is a Christian perspective. Now, there was a belief in Judaism that Messiah would come and restore Israel, the kingdom to Israel, and would bring a lasting peace and victory over her enemies. This Messiah, however, is not a divine being, but he's a human being in Jewish literature. There are a number of passages and even in rabbinic discussions about this. And the reign of this Messiah can be found anywhere from 40 years to 7,000 years. In, for example, the Jewish apocalyptic literature, you see this kind of reign where the Messiah comes and reigns in the fourth Ezra. You have the reign of the Messiah for 400 years, and then at the end of his reign, he dies. So this idea of an earthly kingdom with Israel's Messiah was present, and some think that maybe Revelation is tipping its hat toward this idea of a kingdom what's sometimes called an interregnum, or a transition kingdom between earth and the ultimate eternal heavenly kingdom that we see finally at the book of Revelation. And we can talk a little bit more about that next week. But one of the things I think I would just say about the number 1,000, is what I found about the book of Revelation is all the numbers in the book of Revelation are symbolic. We've seen that. We're going to see more of that when we look at the New Jerusalem. And usually, of course, we've seen the number 7 multiple times. The organizational number around which the structure of Revelation is placed is the number 7. We also have seen the number 12 and multiples of 12. And 12 is the number of God's people. We also have seen the number 10. For example, we had 10 kings who gave their authority to the beast for 1 hour. Again, symbolic time period. And these 10 kings are likely symbolic as well, in the sense that it's not literally 10 kingdoms or 10 kings, nations that give their authority, but 10 is kind of a complete number. It's an indeterminate number. In other words, it's not a literal number that is actually 10, but it's a complete number. So the nations of the earth give their power completely over to the beast. And in the case of 1,000 years, there's probably a sense here of a complete time that is determined by God, but not necessarily a literal time of 1,000 years. Which, if we say that, we are on the road to saying that perhaps the millennium is not a literal millennium. But we'll discuss that more at another time. There are several problems that arise in this passage, which we can look at maybe next week. But some of those problems are, of course, the resurrection. You have what's called the first resurrection, and it appears only the martyrs are raised from the dead. The question is it just the martyrs, or is it all of the saints? You have actually in this chapter two resurrections. You have two judgments, and you have two uh, destruction, not really destructions, but binding, and then a binding of Satan. Really, you get the binding of Satan. He's put in the abyss, and then you get him put into the lake of fire. So you get these things happening multiple times, and the question is, and then of course you have another battle, which is the fourth time we are probably seeing the same battle. That's at the end of chapter 20. So what's going on here? We'll have to talk a little bit more about that next week because we're out of time, but we'll talk about this idea of a millennial reign. Is it literal? Is it figurative? And we'll also talk about this final battle. Is it the same battle that we've seen? And what should we expect in our interpretation of this passage? Won't you join me? Thank you, and God bless you.